I think I can't think of a better speaker next than Dr. Thitinan to make sense of all of this, but particularly I think the chop suey or 7-Eleven analogy of Kavi's really with AOIP sort of trying to be a be-all. Can anything really be a catch-all that keeps everybody in without, well, and be meaningful to the region as well? But I'll leave it to you, Dr. Thitinan.
Thank you very much, Gwen. In Thailand, we call chap chai, which is a mixed vegetable soup. It has everything in it. I'm very intrigued, and I think it's a very rich discussion. I'm not sure about the, might be a little bit less upbeat on the freezer metaphor. I think that Thailand is still very much in the fridge. Maybe out of the freezer, but certainly in the fridge still. Look, I have a little bit of a PowerPoint. I have some students here. For the students, make sure you get your essay question before you leave afterwards. You'll be tested. The rest of you are not tested, but the students will be tested. Normally I don't use PowerPoint, but because they're here, I want to do a little bit. I want to focus on the broad and narrow. So a little bit on the FOIP, how it came about, FOIP, BRI. We will have a session on the Mekong region on November 28th. I think it deserves its own space, its own session. We'll have a public forum similar to this. LMC now is pretty much the only game in town. Very good, rich presentation by Ajahn Pongphisoot about the LMC, LMI. You can see that the LMI, the US LMI, is trying to make its way back. It's trying to up its game, but it's still. I want to note first that BRI and FOIP have come up in a very short time, within the past decade, less than a decade. BRI, 7 years. It's all over the news, all over the map. FOIP, within the last couple of years only, now is the lexicon of the region. So I'll look a little bit about at the broad dynamics, and then some specifics, some narrow views on the AOIP, and I'll do this in the next 20 minutes. So US-China geostrategic rivalry. Remember ASEAN? When you think about ASEAN, okay, this is ASEAN has 10 countries, but in fact the ASEAN 10 is only 20 years old. ASEAN is 52 years old, but it had its full membership of 10 only after 1999. So when you think of ASEAN, remember from 1967 to 1999, it was only 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 countries before it became 10. And ASEAN now, I think, is back where it started. Is facing great power rivalry again. The kind of great power competition that cultivated, that compelled Southeast Asia to come up as an organization. Back then, the great power face-off was between the US and USSR, the Soviet Union. And Southeast Asia was divided along ideological lines. The original 5, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Philippines, on one hand, and you have the Indochina, communist countries on the other hand. After so many decades, so many years, now we have another kind of geostrategic rivalry between US and China. And I see this US and China face-off becoming what I call a non-military war. Not just a trade and technology war, but a non-military war. How it began, there are many contributing factors, but it coincided that there's a concurrence of overlapping timeframes. In the Obama administration, the Obama pivot rebalance kind of tested China at a time when Xi Jinping had just come up. So the Scarborough Show became the first kind of incident in April 2012, and then now South China Sea is pretty much in China's orbit. China has reclaimed and constructed artificial islands, 7 of them, weaponized them now in the South China Sea. But it started from about 2012 after Xi Jinping rose to power and during the Obama pivot rebalance, which in the end was ineffectual, was not that effective. But in the backdrop, against the backdrop of a post-war liberal international order that is breaking down, people talk about the Thucydides trap and all of that, but we have at least a recurrent now of security dilemmas, dilemmas of a guessing game between the superpowers, what's the other side is going to do if I do this, and if they do that, what should I do? And why? Because China has caught up with the US. China has caught up with the US within 2 generations. From 79 to 2010, the Chinese economy expanded 9.91 a year. If you go to Shanghai, Beijing, you'll see that it's as modern and cosmopolitan as Manhattan used to be, but it's newer. And you can go to a lift, you go to a lift in Shanghai and Beijing, you press the lift and you get the wrong floor, you press it again, it goes off. You go to Manhattan, you do the same thing, it won't go off. You still have to go to that floor. That's how new it is. So it's no longer about tariffs and trade and technology, but it involves a whole gamut of statecraft instruments. You see that the US is limiting Chinese student visas, thinking about kicking out the Confucius Institutes. The Chinese government is warning its citizens not to go to America. It has a violent gun culture, so tourism will be affected. So it's now expanding into a kind of the gamut of non-military war. And here's a kind of a chart to illustrate how China has caught up with the US, more or less. This is a trade war, technology war, non-military war that I see as a kind of not a Cold War. The Cold War was US versus Soviet Union. It was military, but it was indirect. US versus China is direct, but it's non-military. So US, Soviet Union, they fought military campaigns in proxy third countries. The Reagan Doctrine, for example, was Angola, Cambodia, Nicaragua. The US-China geopolitical, geoeconomic competition is different because China is the natural successor to the Soviet Union. China is a hybrid of totalitarianism, centralized authority, but with market capitalism. In fact, for that reason, it is more formidable than the Soviet Union. What I fear is that this is going to get a lot worse. The US, back when it was challenged by the Soviet Union, when Sputnik was launched, the US had a big fear in the 1950s. The Soviet Union was ahead of them. So JFK, John F. Kennedy, came to power. I came to office in 1960, and he took a kind of an inspirational approach. He admonished, he challenged Americans to come up with something better, to surpass the Soviet Union. He announced that they would send a man to the moon by the end of the decade, which they did. But it was that kind of inspirational approach to do better than your rival, than your challenger, was the approach of the old. The new approach is more resentful. It's more like, instead of surpassing your competitor, you want to bring the competitor down based on resentment, on identity politics. This is, of course, spearheaded by President Donald J. Trump. But Donald J. Trump is not new to American politics. In fact, if you look at a guy called Pat Buchanan in the 1980s, he espoused exact same platform. It just took them 3 decades to win the White House. FOIP, BRI, this is a theater of the new Titanic tussle. So you have BRI, you have FOIP. FOIP, America, they're famous, and students should know this. We've talked about this. The manifest destiny, right? The 1820s. The U.S. has 2 things: entitlement and inevitability to dominate continental Western Hemisphere. For China, it's a kind of a manifest resurgence. China also feels that it is entitled, that it is inevitable that it will resurge, that it will regain its greatness and glory from 1,000 years ago. So you look at the Silk Road, Belt and Road, the Chinese dream, made in China 2025, I see as a kind of economic upgrading, 2049, developed country status. The US in response, the FOIP has come up in a very short time. When Trump took office, when he was sworn in January 2017, there was no FOIP. He came to Asia for the East Asia Summit. Mid-2017, the White House started talking about Indo-Pacific. He came to Vietnam, Philippines, suddenly he talked about FOIP in speeches. By December 2017, there was a national security strategy based on FOIP. And then the National Defense Strategy, January 2018. In March 2018, they changed Pacific Command to Indo-Pacific Command. By the fall of 2018, I got a new inaugural first issue of the the Air Force Journal of Indo-Pacific Affairs, first edition, fall 2018, last fall. So Indo-Pacific now is a real deal, is their geostrategy now. And Mike Pence talks about the whole government approach, all very consistent. Now they're trying to fund it with the BUILD Act, with the ARIA, but still not a big amount. But they're trying to come up with more funding. From my anecdotes with NSC, DOD, U.S. senior officials, I mean, they are peddling this, they're pushing this very hard. FOIP is the real deal. And here's the map of mainland Southeast Asia is not on the belt and not on the road, but there are 6 corridors of the Belt and Road, and we're on the one corridor called the China, Indochina Peninsula Economic Corridor. So you can see that on the line going south. BRI, the basics of BRI are compelling. 2/3 of the global population, 1/3 of global trade, 2/5 of global GDP. ADB says, Asia will need $27 trillion going forward for infrastructure. For China, it's to diversify global trade routes, rebalance global connectivity. It's an Asia for Asians kind of development strategy. BRI is facing pushback by partner countries and pressed by the trade war now by Hong Kong and Taiwan and so on. So President Xi Jinping, I've noticed, has shown more pragmatism and flexibility of late. You saw the Sri Lanka pushback, Malaysia paused and suspended the East Coast rail link. And Thailand, very slow. We're supposed to build 607 kilometers of rail, but I think we've ended up with about 1.8, 3.5, but half done. If you compare the first Belt and Road Forum speech, second Belt and Road Forum speech by Xi Jinping, very different. The second speech showing more pragmatism. It talked about consultation, sustainable development, risk resilience, sustainability, high quality infrastructure, open, green, clean. This is not the kind of language that normally would come out of Xi Jinping in China when the Belt and Road was first launched for the first couple of years. China and Japan have realigned through third-party cooperation. In fact, the smart city here in Thailand. This is kind of another way now. China is adjusting. They can't go through the front door. So maybe there's a side door, back door, third-party cooperation. China, Japan in Thailand, for example. And why? Because Abe went to China, and Abe also has a lot to think about with Trump not so reliable as before. Japan has pretty much refitted 2 aircraft carriers from helicopter carriers. Not very big, medium size, 50,000 tons. Izumo class. This is within a few months they've done this. So this realignment has followed Abe's trip to Beijing in 2018. They signed 52 memoranda of cooperation, and now there will be a follow-up trip next year. After this year, there will be next year in April. So I think the China-Japan relationship, for the time being, looking up. Because for Abe, Trump reliable. For China, they have a lot on their plate. But how long? We don't know. This is a map of course, Southeast Asia, but I just want to note that we had a presentation on mainland Southeast Asia. You can see that Southeast Asia it's divided geographically by the South China Sea. So it's mainland and maritime. Mainland CLMTV, maritime BIMPS. BIMPS, Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore. So BIMS and CLMTV. This is a military balance. This is just to illustrate that North Korea still has over a million army, and then China, of course, very big. But in a fight, who has more friends in the fight will win the fight most likely. South China Sea, artificial islands, maybe even a base in Cambodia. We had a session last night at FCCT about that. But South China Sea now pretty much in China's orbit. China controls South China Sea. And the US is contesting it. And here's an example of an artificial island with airstrip and facilities, radar, troops, and so on. And here's a US first carrier group, the Liaoning, converted from an old carrier, but formidable. They're building going to launch a second one, building a third one. So China will probably have at least 3 plus, I would think probably at least 6 carrier groups before they can think about a real fight. The US, by contrast, formidable machine. I mean, they have a 12 carrier member arsenal, carrier arsenal, and US carriers are big machines, 100,000 tons. 100,000 tons, twice the size of the Japanese, and 10 times the size of the Thai carrier. A little bit about security in the Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific. I think that the Asia-Pacific now is being eclipsed by the Indo-Pacific. I've written that. So shifting center of gravity shifts this way. The South China Sea is kind of in the middle of it. China knows that the economic prowess is not enough, so it has embarked on an unprecedented military buildup. The US under Trump is also very focused on the military buildup, still very strong military. Japan is spending a record defense budget. There are other issues, the Korean Peninsula, Taiwan Strait, Hong Kong. We're seeing a Quad-driven FOIP vis-a-vis China, BRI. China has a big ally in Russia. So all of this, within this mix, ASEAN has come up with AOIP. And we've heard some very insightful interpretations of the AOIP. For me, it's, of course, I think that we all see AOIP as a clever move to handle the FOIP, BRI. The language is, kind of 7-Eleven, has everything, but the way to look at it, so I went to look at the actual wording. So the AOIP mentions the East Asia Summit, the TAC as well. TAC is kind of a invitation for anyone to join, a way of roping in other countries from near and far. But the East Asia Summit was mentioned several times, so I think this is ASEAN's answer to the FOIP, which means that we don't need another geostrategic frame. We have everything that can be found that is needed is within this AOIP, and East Asia Summit allows for the kind of dialogue and conversations that need to take place. Beyond this, I think that we will have to see the responses from the US. I'm not sure if the US will be satisfied with the AOIP answer, but the US cannot press too hard, and this will be the ASEAN way of maintaining its central role and try to play off the US and China and hedging, balancing in between. Going forward, FOIP is going to gain more legs. Trump or no Trump, but most likely second term of Trump. But you can see, I can feel from a think tank perspective, there are a lot more workshops, more funding for FOIP. They want to have FOIP in ASEAN workshops, and the US is stepping up hard. Last week, 2 weeks ago, there was as an example, there was the regional Chiefs of Army annual conference, right, in Bangkok. And it was changed from the Pacific to the Indo-Pacific. So now all the language coming out of the State Department, the DOD, the White House, NSCs are all Indo-Pacific. And then more officially, FOIP, free and open Indo-Pacific. For China, this is going to rub them in some way. I think that BRI for them is a long-term strategy. And for them, no other way to do it. On the ground, they're a little bit behind schedule, but they're finding ways to progress. So in Laos, this is kind of a pilot flagship now. The rail is almost half done. And by 2021, I think it will get done, and we'll have some rail most likely in Thailand. I'm not sure if the SICPEC, Indo-China Peninsula Economic Corridor, will go all the way to Singapore. That's a long stretch. But look at the Malaysia as a kind of a sign of things to come. If they can do the East Coast rail link, then I think maybe we might have a train all the way from Kunming through Vientiane, through Nong Khai, Nakhon Ratchasima, and then Bangkok, all the way to Singapore. Very possible. For China, this manifest resurgence will not be denied. And I think, some anecdotes. For example, now Chinese top talent, tech talent, when they go work for Huawei, they don't think it's just a job for Huawei. They think they're working for them. They're fighting back. So in China, within China, there's a lot of stress within, but it's becoming a little bit of a nationalist issue. They feel like they're being encircled and contained and pushed around. And this dynamic for the US is the same. So they're going to push back hard. And this kind of bipolar face-off we've seen before, and we're seeing again. And I think for ASEAN, this is a dilemma from the past, blast from the past, but it's going to be the main paramount challenge for ASEAN in the first half of the 21st century, dealing with this face-off between China and the US. AOIP is a good start, but ASEAN will need a lot more. ASEAN also will need to heal the divisions from within. I am hopeful. AOIP launched by Thailand, I think during Thailand's chair is very good because next year Vietnam, not a good kind of image for AOIP. Indonesia would have liked to claim more credit, but it's a good indication that ASEAN, when it needs to, it can get its act together. AOIP is one example. So Cambodia didn't oppose it, it came out, but it's only a beginning. ASEAN has to do a lot more. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Thitinan, for an absolutely perfect summary and extra perspectives on all that. Actually, if I may just, one little follow-up, and just to add on the AOIP issue and the whole, what did we call it, Tepchai or chop suey analogy. One thing, perhaps Thailand is still in the fridge, but as you say, has managed to get this AOIP off the ground. However, in its kind of effort to be all things to all people in the region, one thing that perhaps has struck us, I think, in recent months is all the concern raised by Cambodia, the reports about Cambodia's deals with China on a military base, and how that would, in a way, Cambodia being a key member of ASEAN, I mean, how does that play out or affect the whole sort of efforts, particularly by Thailand, to portray AOIP as something for everyone and the chop suey kind of arrangement?
There have been reports in the international media that Cambodia may or already have allowed the Chinese to set up a military base around Ream, which is near Sihanoukville, and no persuasive evidence to my eye yet. But this would not be surprising going forward. It may not be a full-fledged military base, but it might function like one. It could be dual use, and in times of conflict and in times of need, China can use, I think, facilities like that within Cambodia. It certainly would complement and reinforce the Chinese weaponized artificial islands. If you look at the South China Sea, imagine the South China Sea, the 7 weaponized islands, artificial islands. Now, if they have a land-based military base for the Air Force and for supplies and refueling, this is a major strategic catch for Cambodia, alongside already a base in Djibouti, Pakistan, Gwadar. If they have one in Cambodia, this will allow China to kind of complement and reinforce its BRI aims. BRI is about infrastructure development and growth and so on, but it also has a military component. I mean, there's now a company by Eric Prince offering services for BRI projects. So, it goes together, Gwent. I mean, on the BRI, they also have some muscle. There needs also some muscle. I think Cambodia has been a kind of a weak link within ASEAN on China, almost seen as a Chinese client state. But also Cambodia is not dogmatic, as I said before, not static. It also has its own way of balancing. If China loses its way, internal stress, strain, makes missteps, it would not be surprising that Cambodia will step a little bit more away from China.
I think perhaps that's a lot of food for thought, which is the challenge that this presents for ASEAN trying to portray AOIP as fairly neutral, or at least non-aligned. I wonder if any of the Dr. Pongphisoot, you might have a thought on that.
Not to mention about this issue, but continuing from what Ajahn Thitinan was talking about, the possibilities of having a military base in Cambodia by the Chinese, right? This is possible, even though we don't have the empirical evidence at the moment. But if you look at the whole effort of the Chinese side to trying to consolidate its presence in mainland Southeast Asia. If I will recall you the I don't want to talk about this. It's going to be a long issue. The issue of Grand Canal has been returned, like in the front line of media for quite some time.
Maybe
and
you
if
could remind people what Grat Canal.
Yeah, well, probably a lot of you would know that Grat Canal is going to be a shortcut, right? Like between Gulf of Thailand and the Andaman Sea in the Indian Ocean. So if you look at these these rumors or whatever that you have, you can see this connected dot, right, from the rail link from Kunming, from China to mainland Southeast Asia and to Singapore that Thitinan just mentioned earlier. That would be like the one of the big project. But if anything goes wrong, I mean, the Chinese, of course, as other country would have done, to find the possibilities of embedding its political and military presence here. The issue of the Grat Canal would allow the Chinese to pass through if pass through the sea, doesn't have to pass through the Malacca Strait, all right? They have to pass through Grat Canal if it's successfully digged. So if you look at the link from China through the rail link to Thailand and the promotions of the EEC in the Eastern Seaboard, that would probably tap into the Chinese, economic growth. You can see the link that, the goods and products and services from China could come through Thailand and then doesn't have to pass through like the tension, the conflict areas in South China Sea. So the Grat Canal would be the possibility, that the Chinese would seek, and then military base in Cambodia would be another, base to protect this interest if it's possible.
I'd like to welcome questions from the audience. Please just identify yourself.
Sure. Brad Merg, Professor of Political Science, Seattle Pacific University and the University of Washington. Because Kavi sort of opened the door on this with the reference to France's statement on the Indo-Pacific. And that's a rather remarkable document in and of itself. It begins by discussing U.S.-China competition as the great threat that France is responding to, but in its policy statements, it never says a word about the United States. Increasingly, the document is viewed as a neo-Gaullist statement of foreign policy by France that is illustrative of the declining French-American relationship. So what is the role of, how has that been perceived in the region? Is it perceived as having credibility? And at the same time, just more broadly, following Thitinnan's point about this getting worse, the US-China competition, what is the EU's role? Or what is the EU's role with ASEAN or in this entire context? Thanks very much.
My short answer is that the role of EU is very problematic. Of course, when the French came out, the French view itself as a very unique member of United Nations Security Council. Its strategic interests cover the whole wide Pacific region as well. And I think given the decline as the French will decline in power and also the trust, the strategic trust of the United States has gone down. I think the role of EU should automatically rise, but that is not the case. When you talk about France, you have to also keep in mind the other two powerful countries. One of them is UK, which is leaving EU. The other one is Germany, which has in itself tried to formulate its own security profile within the region, but it has gained very, very difficult, what do you call, a barrier to cross, because the reception from ASEAN toward this EU have been very unreceptive. Because at the moment, ASEAN-EU relations are pretty bad. And it was very unfortunate given what EU has given to ASEAN for the past 44 years. Number one, they're the biggest aid donor, help with the capacity building. Now they get stuck. Can you imagine? EU, after all this year, has not yet been declared officially as strategic partner of ASEAN. It is ridiculous. But while ASEAN consensus is very important, now Indonesia and Malaysia are the main obstacle. It's not Cambodia though. A lot of people thought it's Cambodia, the EU attitude toward the so-called other policy. But it's the attitude of Malaysia and Indonesia over palm oil that really, really stopped. EU is important for ASEAN, and we need EU in strategic area. And I think increasing the role of France, the roles of Germany, you know, in non-traditional area will increase. But you must get support from ASEAN in general first. But if you cannot overcome this palm oil thing, I think both sides are trying to overcome that. Set up a working group, but I think it will take a long time because the way Indonesia respond, the way Malaysia respond, and together they jointly respond to EU is not something that give a very optimistic view. But certainly, for one, I think EU relation with ASEAN should be more comprehensive, involving much more strategic component, particularly on maritime cooperation. And when you talk about France, France also has a very interesting features because it signed Treaty of Amity cooperation, knowing full well that it can be very useful, and then later on followed by UK and then EU.
Thanks, Kavi. And can I just add, I think it's good you brought that document up, the French one, because it also interestingly proposed in this earlier point about minilateralism. France has also raised in that document an axis that would link France with, is it India and Australia, some kind of bizarre arrangement like that. And also it reaffirmed its commitment to a strong relationship with China. And yet, at the same time, France has been very, very anti-signs that some EU countries, for example, Italy, have signed up to BRI, and France is really anti-that. So.
Yeah, one of the unique things about the French strategy is that it has environmental security with very good resonance among ASEAN. As Dr. Kasira mentioned that at the ASEAN summit we approve and we must continue to fight, combat maritime debris. So that's, I think, resonates very well.
Thitinan, would you like to comment?
Somewhat like ASEAN, EU is together and apart at the same time, right? So it's a collective, but it's also individual. So, EU used to be, the sum of the EU used to be greater than the whole, greater than the EU itself, but now I think much less so. So I think the individual pathways, like the French, the UK, we will see more of that in the security realm. These are blue water navies. The other countries don't have that kind of a power projection. At the same time, EU can still do a lot in other areas, non-security areas, especially trade, investment, tourism, environment, climate change, and so on. The free trade agreement, for example. But when it comes to security, I think that we will see more individual pathways, especially for blue water navies.
Thank you.
Yes, just add, Kavi and Dr. Thitinan. I think EU-ASEAN cooperations always get delayed or blocked by the EU adherence to the principles of human rights and democratizations and democracies in these regions. And you see from the early, post-Cold War era when, EU plays its role in the setup of the ASEM, when it denies Myanmar to be part of ASEM, and if ASEM is Asia-Europe meeting. So and the military coups in Thailand in the past, 5 years also, stimulate this kind of, policy priorities that EU wants to play in ASEAN. So, so it's a partner, it's important trade partners, and ASEAN wants EU's role in security cooperations, but we see these obstacles in between these two regional cooperations, on these priorities of democratizations and human rights as well.
I think EU now has been more flexible toward this issue. It's no longer hard hit like before. It shows the pragmatic side of EU, because you have to treat a situation, for example, in Thailand. I think EU make a big mistake in treating Thailand the way it has done, okay? But I think you need a much more practical, on-the-ground assessment in each country in ASEAN, especially related to norms and values.
You know, the trade.
No, not only trades, on human rights.
Okay. At least you know that they've been nasty to other countries as well. Kasira, and then we will take the last few questions after this.
I just add a little bit. I'll just go back to Kun Gwen's earlier question to Kun Kavi as well, because I think it's very interesting. I mean, what China is unhappy the most is the word free, I think, because the AOIP actually mentions freedom, I mean, in passing in the objectives, and even openness in its principles, but there's nothing about the free, which will imply that there's some country that is not free. And the US actually uses the word repressive. So I think China and ASEAN actually avoid to use the word free to be more inclusive. Regarding the norms though and the EU roles, I think what the recent development, I mean the AOIP, what ASEAN has been trying to do that is more inclusive is that to make it much more difficult for the partner to extract itself and like act unilaterally. So ASEAN tries to make it like more difficult for China to just go off and do its own thing like in the past. So what's interesting is that EU would be, like happy as well, is that the reference, very clear reference to international law, such as the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and the recent development that Chinese survey ship actually entered Vietnamese EEZ, actually violate that kind of rules, and ASEAN referred to that very, very clearly in the AOIP, that's what it's respecting, and that should be the synergies with the EU norms and principles as well, because there's been this partnership with a strategic purpose between ASEAN and EU for quite some time, but it hasn't been developed. I mean, there was talks in January earlier this year to kind of upgrade EU to become a strategic partner, but then that was not achieve the consensus from all ASEAN member countries. So there's still, like as Thitinan said, a lot of things that EU could cooperate with ASEAN, just as like the marine cooperation, climate change, and also some of the norms like to kind of create this regional architecture become like a more rule-based system as a whole is also what EU and ASEAN can cooperate on as well.
I would like to come back for more such discussions. I was intrigued that during the various remarks which were made, there was no reference to, of course, there are different visions of the Indo-Pacific, to Prime Minister Modi's own speech last year at the Shangri-La Dialogue, where he outlined the Indian vision of the Indo-Pacific, which includes 6 elements, where he very clearly outlined that our vision of the Indo-Pacific is that it's free and it's open, it's not a club, it's not closed clubs, it's not aimed at anybody. And while it has a natural definition which includes, the geography from the eastern coast of Africa all the way to the Pacific Islands, it also includes other stakeholders, external actors who have a stake in the region. So nobody is really excluded from our own vision of the Indo-Pacific. We also spoke of ASEAN centrality, which is very important for us. It was also, there was stress on the rules-based order for multilateralism, particularly in trade, and on connectivity. So this is the Indian vision of the Indo-Pacific, which I think is also a very important aspect, because India is also, an important player in this entire geography that we talk about, the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. Second point that you made about the vision, the approach of China and maybe Russia to the Indo-Pacific, we ourselves, the Indian leadership, has been talking to both China and to Russia, including at the RIC, the Russia-India-China Dialogue Mechanism, and including at the Eastern Economic Forum, which took place at Vladivostok very recently. This was discussed. And in our own discussions, we have seen that both the Chinese and the Russian have been quite positively inclined in our bilateral discussions. The third point that you mentioned about the trilateral exercise, I would, yes, it is going on. We're very happy about it. It's happening off the eastern seaboard of India, of Visakhapatnam. But this is actually predates our discussions on the Indo-Pacific. It sort of meshes with it, but it's not really, in that sense, a new development. It is the result of discussions which have been going on for almost a decade in this connection. And I think Mekong region cooperation. India was the first country to actually get into an institutional cooperation with the Mekong region countries. The Mekong-Ganga cooperation is 20 years old. It's doing a lot of good work, very quietly, very below the radar, but it's actually the oldest cooperative mechanism in the region. Thank you.
I am a local publisher. How do you weigh the importance of Southeast Asia and the road and belt concept from China's point of view? The Southeast Asia belongs to the, it seems, to the American sea power sphere, while the rest is combining Europe with China, a land connection where America has much less influence, including the Northern Sea route, which is developing. It seems to me that that is the first step for America, for China, to get an upper hand with Europe in trade connections, right, where America cannot interfere. And then to Kun Kavi, one question that Thailand is coming up. How does it, the anti-foreign trend now, how does it come with connectivity and talk with each other?
You would like to start with that question of the importance or role of Southeast Asia in BRI.
Okay, I think I'll just be brief. The ambassador of India talked about the role of India, and it's interesting in this in the Quad. I see India in the Quad as not the most enthusiastic one. The U.S. is very much at the forefront, and then Australia, then kind of Japan. India has its own path, and it has that legacy of non-aligned, its own. There's a big size. So when it comes to the FOIP, the reference from India, I notice it's not so much the FOIP as per Washington's preference, Washington's view, but maybe a little bit more like emphasis on the Indo-Pacific rather than the free and open Indo-Pacific, which I think is interesting that India, what Prime Minister Modi said last year at Shangri-La, very much supportive of ASEAN centrality, very much supportive of it. And India has shown, I think, that it would not be roped in to the US agenda of the FOIP. One thing I would say, the negotiations this year about the RCEP, and for India to really be hitched to the Indo-Pacific, India will have to kind of hook itself into the trade forum, the trade pact. So RCEP, if it's finalized, it will be very important for India as a way of making concrete connections on the ground. Otherwise, the Indo-Pacific, remember, it doesn't have an economic component, unlike the pivot rebalance at the TPP. But RCEP, for the neighborhood, in this neighborhood, is important because a lot of the countries in ASEAN, 6 of them not in the CPTPP. The Southeast Asia BRI, BRI to Europe, I mean, the conceptualization of BRI is not North American, is the Eurasian landmass, and is an old Silk Road, is a Zhanghe maritime expeditions. So if you look at the map, it goes all across the Eurasia and then all the way through South Asia, through East Africa. And this is from, they have a historical basis for it. So I don't think it was a design just to exclude America, just America was not, North America was not within the Chinese imperial setup to begin with. Thailand anti-foreign, just be very quick, I'll let we talk more about this. I think he's not as critical of the Thai military government as me. You know, when you have a military government in power for 5 years plus, things get militarized. And so I don't think this, it was specifically designed to be anti-foreign, but it has come off that way. And I actually think that we should have the opposite policy, to use immigration policy as a strategy for economic upgrading, attracting foreign talent, using Thailand. People love to come to Thailand. They like to spend time in Chiang Mai, Chiang Rai. As long as they have good internet, they can work anywhere. There are a lot of these people, a lot of talented people who want to come to Thailand, and we're making it very hard for them to come and to stay. So in fact, immigration policy should be used as a strategy for economic upgrading.
Right. Can I just say, as the only non-Thai on the panel, I can say the TM30 angst over the new reporting requirements for foreigners is really, I think actually it's not just a practical thing, it's actually being taken as this very anti-foreign kind of move.
Yes, I agree with Dr. Thitinan, that was a bad policy. I like to focus on India. Actually, India lost a very good opportunity since 2003 as the first country along with China signed the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, entered the internal sanctum of ASEAN but did not do anything except the East-West, the so-called look-east. And as Modi has mentioned 20 times in Indo-Pacific, ASEAN, 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 we love ASEAN, India love ASEAN, and ASEAN also love India. That's why they get together last year in January. But when it comes to action, 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 there's no more. And that is why I think India has to provide the kind of impetus to the much needed ASEAN-India cooperation, particularly as Dr. Thitinan pointed out, RCEP is very crucial, and the attitude of India in coming out, which will make this dialogue successful or not, conclusion or not in this November is very important. And that will be a big factor in determining India's role in the future. There's a lot of talk since 2003. India has made the best policy toward ASEAN in June 2003 when they acceded to treaty. Since then, there's a lot of talk. There's no concrete action. And I think that must come out and through various action because, you know, ASEAN is very friendly to India, and India is also friendly to ASEAN, but the action between that cement the two has not yet really come out that much.
Thank you. Would either of the...
Yes, I agree with Kunkawi is that the dynamic between ASEAN and India is quite lagging. You know, it recalls me to my practitioner experience, back in National Security Council in early 2000s, and then we started the joint working group on transnational crime and whatsoever as prior elements to opening for free trade agreement between Thailand and India. And then, since then, even though the cooperations continues as I followed the cooperations, but the dynamic has been waning, and as you say, that India is the first dialogue partners and to Mekong sub-regions. But as I show you that perhaps more activities need to be rolled out within this umbrella compared to the push from other stakeholders. India is quite to be honest quite behind these actors, and probably you can suggest New Delhi to roll more activities with ASEAN. And I would like to add a little bit on what Dr. Thitinan left, that perhaps a free and open Indo-Pacific doesn't have that much economic aspect. Is that what you say? Yeah, but interestingly, I just listened to a YouTube channel, on the review of the Indo-Pacific strategy and on the economic pillar. And interestingly, as we understand that the Asia-Pacific term or concept is waning in the policy making in the U.S. and Washington, but we see the gradual embracements of APEC again to be one of the pillar of these Indo-Pacific strategy. They have like a plan as to use APEC as another, not as the old role, but impose some of the new role to APEC to represent this Indo-Pacific economic pillar, and I think the U.S. is trying to do that on the economic front. And interestingly, if you look at as the last point I want to mention, if you look at the ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific, the word Asia-Pacific is still there. And it probably is a compromise between the U.S. versions and what perhaps China's or want-to visions on the security arrangements in this region. So it said like Asia-Pacific and Indian Ocean regions not as contiguous territorial space, and it's just closely integrated and interconnected regions. So we still see this kind of competing sort of concepts in ASEAN visions of this Indo-Pacific, and we see the attempt to renew the importance of APEC from Washington side. So perhaps we have to wait and see how these Indo-Pacific concepts going to be crystallized in the near future, to see the turn of the new strategy of the United States.
Thank you very much. I think we're out of time, and I'd just like to say that I think the four of you have given an excellent spread of views, and I hope, I think even I learned quite a bit. I don't mean even. I learned quite a bit. I mean, nobody can learn. Actually, this is like a language that keeps new terms and words keep being added because seems to be a new or agreement every week. But this really came a long way to helping us interpret what's really going on, and I think getting a much clearer perspective of what AOIP is and the way that FOIP is evolving, and also China's BRI. So I'd like to give a big thanks to this wonderful panel, and to all of you for coming, and to Frederick Naumann Foundation for their support for the event. So thank you very much.